The case of Albert Fish. Now, the case of Albert Fish just goes to show how good some people can really put on a real class act. See, Albert Fish was the kind of upstanding gentleman you'd be proud to bring home to your mother. Well, at least if your mother happened to have a liking for the flavored meat of small children, that is. Let me elaborate. Fish didn't just kill, he savored every agonizing moment, every opportunity to inflict pain and degradation on his victims before finally eating them slowly. The details that emerged about his torture methods and consuming body parts are absolutely insane. His method of operation seemed to involve luring children with promises of treats or jobs, only to imprison and subject them to crazy cruelties. Accounts describe how he would force his victims to endure burns, beatings, and even cutting off portions of their bodies while still alive. Some reports suggest he engaged in sexual violations with the children as well. Court testimony revealed how he harvested and consumed body parts, muscles, organs, you name it, often while his victims were still breathing. More than once, he admitted to decapitating kids, frying up portions of their bodies, and actually eating them. What made him especially evil was his outward personality as a kindly old grandfatherly type. He really used that trusted image to lure targets into his clutches with patient calculation, pretending to be a humble Christian believer one moment only to reveal his true self as a butcher the next. For years, Fish flew under the radar, satisfying his appetites while taunting the authorities with his crimes. It wasn't until he ironically confessed in one of his own deranged letters that justice finally caught up to him in 1935. Ultimately, the world said good riddance to Fish when that electric chair switch was flipped in 1936. The Alexander Pearce case. Alexander Pearce and his fellow 4 convicts were essentially prisoners exiled from Britain to the remote penal colony of Macquarie Harbor. Life was a daily grind of back-breaking labor and meager rations all day, every day, till they died. So, when Pearce and 7 other convict settlers made a desperate escape into the forest in 1822, you can imagine the combination of fear and determination driving them. But as the weeks dragged on and supplies ran out, that determination twisted into desperation. You can picture Pearce walking alongside his starving mates, realizing they were hopelessly lost and facing a slow death by starvation. That's when the unthinkable became their only option. They had to kill and consume the flesh of their companions to go on. The acts began when one person fell behind, dying of exhaustion and hunger. The others didn't even wait for him to die naturally. Pearce himself allegedly took the lead in killing and rationing the man's remains for the survival of the others. Over the next couple of months, the routine repeated itself, with 3 more unfortunate souls meeting the same fate. When soldiers finally stumbled upon the 4 prisoners 15 weeks later, the remaining cannibals confessed their awful acts openly with no shame or remorse. They basically said it was a matter of life and death. It was them or us, and I don't know about you, but I'm not dying on an empty stomach. To them, it was a simple solution to their problem. But old Pearce took it even further on his next escape attempt with another convict in 1823. This time, he didn't hesitate. Within just a week on the run, he killed and consumed his companion for food. When he was discovered back near Hobart, old Pearce was carrying chunks of human flesh, not even trying to hide his career as a cannibal. At his trial, he was positively nonchalant about the whole grisly business, claiming he killed and ate simply for a meal. Rotenburg Cannibal. This one is quite the rabbit hole. Imagine going online and seeing an ad from someone literally looking for a person to slaughter and eat. Well, that's exactly what happened in Armin Maiwei's bizarre case known as the Rotenburg Cannibal. In 2001, Maiwei's posted a crazy ad stating he wanted to find a willing victim who wanted to be killed and consumed. Weirdly enough, a guy named Bernd Brandes from Berlin answered his call as he had held a strange longing to be eaten. After meeting up and confirming their intense desires, Maiwei and Brandes filmed the whole process. Just let that scene play out in your mind. Brandes allowed himself to be mutilated, killed, and then eaten by Maiwei over the course of months. However, once Maiwei began searching looking for more victims online, his activities became known to the police as some users on the site reported him after realizing he was actually serious. So the police searched his home and they discovered body parts and arrested him back in 2002. The revelations were downright insane. Meiwes had severed and tried to eat Brandis's genitals. He stored his body parts to eat over time, consuming about 20 kilos in total over 6 months. In 2006, Meiwes was, surprise, convicted of manslaughter, as the court ruled that Brandis's consent didn't justify violating human dignity through cannibalism. The Franklin Expedition. Picture this. A crew of 129 people, led by Sir John Franklin, set sail on a voyage to conquer the Northwest Passage near Antarctica. Little did they know they were about to become the main course on a menu they never intended to order from. As the Arctic chill set in and their supplies dwindled, the men found themselves in a desperate situation. At first, things were probably fairly disciplined, but food supplies ran low. Everyone was on strict rations, doing their best to share what little was left. But then that fateful day arrives when the last scraps are gone and hunger becomes the all-consuming driving force. With no other options, they turned to the only source of food, each other. You can imagine the almost animal look in the eyes as they started eyeing each other differently. The sizing up of who among them might provide the most food. John's looking rather juicy today. From the evidence of the wreckage, it seems like some crew members may have gotten a bit too comfortable with acting on those impulses. Butchering their former shipmates, defleshing the bodies, cracking into bones for that marrow-rich nutrition. It's crazy to think about what other desperate acts those men might have committed as their situation worsened. Stress, hunger, and loss of leadership likely led them to do whatever they could to survive. Even after eating each other, cannibalism didn't save them all in the end, as evidence shows that they all still died hungry. But at least that's one thing they can cross off their bucket list: trying human flesh. Richard Chase, 1970s. Imagine living in a quiet neighborhood of Sacramento back in the 1970s. You've heard the local news reports about a series of bizarre break-ins where people's dogs and cats have gone missing or have been found mutilated. But then the crimes take an even darker, more disturbing turn. Word starts to spread about the body of a young woman found literally half-eaten in her own apartment. Not long after, a baby is discovered stolen from a family's home, with the remains of its corpse found stuffed in a box under a truck, partially eaten. So who did all this? A young man named Richard Chase, who lived right in your community. An Army veteran just back from the war, Chase was quite literally spiraling into severe mental illness, developing a bloodlust and obsession with acts of vampirism. He saw nothing wrong with breaking into homes to drink the blood of his victims and consume the raw flesh and organs, even going an extra step further sometimes by killing their pets as well and consuming them to prevent his own heart from shrinking. Finally, in January 1978, Chase's insanity reached its highest when he murdered a pregnant woman, Teresa Whalen, and ate her body, including the infant inside of her too. Chase was arrested soon after, readily confessing to his acts and showing no remorse. To him, it was just another day at work, eating and killing people here and there when necessary. Diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, Chase was found legally insane but was later deemed fit to stand trial. In 1979, he was convicted of 6 counts of murder and sustained multiple life sentences. The Natalia Baksheeva and Dmitry Baksheev case. So the two were a married couple living in a small Siberian town near Krasnoyarsk in the 90s. Times were really tough for them. They were both unemployed and struggled to get by. Like, we're talking about going days without any food levels of poverty. So in this really horrible, desperate situation, they started luring people back to their apartments and killing them to eat their flesh. Authorities found body parts, severed heads, and all that when they raided the place. The reports say they may have offed as many as 30 people this way. Let's say it could really have been that they were really hungry, but past the 5th body, one must think they actually started liking human flesh, or just human jerky tasted a bit too good. But here's where the story gets crazier. They were apparently even selling the human meat at the local market, just putting it out there alongside the regular butcher stock. It's pretty much rock bottom in terms of insane acts. The couple tried to claim hunger drove them to it, but authorities weren't buying it as any excuse. So they were both sentenced to death by hanging. Peter Bryan, 2004. So imagine casually going over to a friend's apartment, maybe for a drink, and then never never being seen again. That's the fate that fell on at least 2 different men at the hands of Peter Bryan in 2004. Bryan seemed like an ordinary guy living in a nondescript London flat, but behind that face lurked a secret desire, a craving to not just kill, but to eat human flesh. It all started when Bryan met a guy named Brian Cherry at a local pub and lured him back to his place. Once there, Bryan overpowered and strangled Cherry to death, but he didn't stop there. This guy then dismembered Cherry's body, keeping his head and other parts stored in his very own bathtub for days. As twisted as that seems, Bryan took it a step further into insanity. He boiled portions of Cherry's flesh to eat over the course of several days, savoring the man he had just murdered. Just a few months later, Brian Jones suffered a similar nightmare fate. After meeting up, Jones ended up strangled and hacked apart, with Bryan again treating parts of his body. When police finally caught on to Bryan's acts, the evidence was just insane. Plastic bins in his apartment containing the dismembered remains and body parts of his victims, and Bryan freely admitting to the killings and cannibalism without an ounce of remorse or humanity. His motivation? Just a desire to taste human flesh, which he described as tender and nice. Except for being a cannibal murderer, Bryan lived as a strict vegetarian. Talk about a split personality. The Siege of Leningrad. Now, imagine being a resident of Leningrad in the early years of the 1940s. Your great city, the cultural capital of the Soviet Union, is under relentless bombardment and blockade by the invading Nazi forces. The city's population of 3 million civilians was completely cut off from food supplies by the German blockade. An estimated 700,000 people perished from hunger-related causes alone. Food supplies have been completely cut off for months on end. People around you are wasting away from severe malnutrition and starvation. As food sources dwindle to nothing, citizens resort to eating glue, wallpaper paste, leather, sawdust, and even dirt in an attempt to survive. Soon enough, acts of cannibalism were committed by the starving citizens, doing whatever it took for them to survive. Ironically, butcher shops started selling human flesh from bodies taken from mass graves. Some made pies filled with human meat and chalk, while the more ambitious hunt for corpses or committed murder to obtain this source of food. A documentary film shot in 1942 showed starving citizens exchanging jewelry for a meat pie made from human flesh and blood. While condemned, cannibalism was quite literally accepted by authorities as a means of survival in this most extreme of situations. Now, unless you want to end up on this list because I ate you and your family for not subscribing to the Evaluator, you better join the Discord server, the Donner Party. It's 1846, and you're part of a group of American pioneers heading to California for a better life, led by George Donner and James F. Reed. Everything goes wrong when you decide to take a new, supposedly shorter route. It turns out to be poorly mapped and way harder than expected, and you end up trapped in the mountains during a brutal winter. So then you're stranded for months on end, bone-chilling temperatures sapping your strength, and nothing to eat but twigs and rabbit skin gloves. You might just catch a passing glance at your traveling companions like they're walking steak. Now, trapped in the mountains with no hope of escape, they soon obviously ran out of food. The wildlife seemed to have gone on vacation, and fishing was about as productive as trying to catch a fish with a hula hoop. As the weeks turned into months, the situation grew worse. Starvation set in, and people started dropping like flies. At this point, they faced a truly crazy decision: eat or be eaten. And thus, cannibalism entered the menu. Of course, in their defense, these were desperate times requiring desperate food. In the end, roughly half of the original Donner Party survived that winter by completely revising the meaning of comrade and family style. The Andes flight disaster. In October 1972, you're one of the rugby team from Uruguay, and you're flying over the Andes Mountains on your way back to a match in Chile. Suddenly, your plane hits a nasty pocket of turbulence and goes off course like a kid's model airplane in a windstorm. Next thing you know, you're slamming into the side of a glacial peak at 20,000 feet up. The plane crashes, scattering luggage and rugby balls across the freezing mountains. As the remaining 29 survivors took stock of their situation, the realities began to sink in. They were stuck in a never-ending snow globe surrounded by endless rock with sub-zero temperatures, doing their best not to turn everyone into human popsicles. Now, your average bunch of folks might have just thrown in the towel, huddled together, and awaited their frosty fate, but not this group. Before long, they were searching through the wreckage like raccoons at a trash party, devouring any supplies and morsels they could find. Within days, their stockpiles were empty. That's when the unthinkable starts seeming, well, thinkable. With all the food gone, you face a choice: break a huge taboo or become an ice sculpture yourself. Some decided to go with option 1. These guys got resourceful with the only protein source left. Let's just say a few of their fallen comrades ended up being the main course for the group. 72 days after their cliffside Andean pileup, 2 stragglers were spotted by a search crew and rescue. In all, 16 survivors out of 45 endured 2 months engaged in extreme cooking classes. The Issei Sagawa case. Issei Sagawa seemed to be just an ordinary guy living in Paris back in 1981. However, he had one weird obsession that no one knew about. He ate people. He just straight up murdered and cannibalized one of his classmates, a Dutch woman named Renee Hartveld. So imagine you're Renee. He shot you in the neck, made love with your corpse, and then spent days eating different parts of your body. Not just a little taste here and there, the man was full-on feasting on her remains. He even tried dissolving what he didn't want to eat in a bathtub of caustic soda. Now, once he got arrested, one would think that with his crimes, he's going away forever. But due to some old French insanity laws at the time, even though he was judged sane enough to stand trial, he just gets put in psychiatric detention for a few years. But the plot gets worse, as in 1986, they literally just let him go back to Japan while still under supervision. So he literally brutally murdered and ate someone, and he gets to just leave. Not only does Sagawa never really get properly punished, but he has zero remorse about the whole thing. The guy tries to capitalize on his newfound fame by writing books about his crime and doing interviews. No guilt, no empathy for his victim, just hashing in on being a cannibalistic murderer.